He only sought shelter for the night, but the alien girl chose him as her mate for life. The storm came without warning, and Jake Collins had no choice but to seek refuge in the nearest cave he could find on the strange purple planet where his ship had crash-landed 3 days ago, and he never expected to find anyone living there, much less a beautiful alien woman with silver skin and eyes that glowed like stars in the darkness. She stood at the back of the cave watching him with curiosity, rather than fear, and her long white hair floated around her shoulders, as if moved by an invisible wind, and Jake froze, not knowing if he should run or stay. But the rain was pouring so hard outside that going back meant certain death from the cold. Alien woman tilted her head and made a soft musical sound that seemed to vibrate through his chest, and then she gestured for him to come deeper into the cave, where a small fire burned with blue flames that gave off warmth without smoke. And Jake hesitated, but his soaking clothes and shivering body made the decision for him. He moved closer to the fire, and she watched every step he took with those luminous eyes. And when he sat down, she approached him slowly, like someone might approach a wild animal, and she reached out one slender hand with 4 fingers instead of 5, and touched his wet jacket with wonder in her expression. Jake tried to speak to her, but she did not understand English, and he did not understand the melodic sounds she made in return, but somehow they began to communicate through gestures and expressions, and she brought him something warm to drink in a cup made of smooth stone, and the liquid tasted like honey mixed with starlight, if such a thing were possible. As the night went on, she kept looking at him in a way that made him nervous, and she would touch his hair or his face with gentle fingers as if memorizing every detail, and Jake noticed that her silver skin had patterns that seemed to shift and change in the firelight like living tattoos that told stories he could not read. Then she did something that confused him completely, because she brought out a small glowing crystal from a pouch at her waist, and she pressed it to his hand and then to her own, and the crystal flashed with bright light. And suddenly Jake felt a connection to her that he could not explain, as if their minds had touched for just a moment. Through that brief connection, he understood that among her people, this was how mates were chosen, and the crystal would only glow if 2 beings were compatible. And she had been alone in this cave for so long, waiting for someone who could make the crystal shine, and now she believed he was her destined partner. Jake pulled his hand back in shock, because he had only wanted shelter from the storm, and now this alien woman thought he was her mate for life. And he tried to explain through frantic gestures that there had been a mistake, but she only smiled at him with such joy and certainty that he felt terrible for wanting to refuse her. But she was not human, and he knew nothing about her or her culture, and he had a life waiting for him back on Earth if he could ever repair his ship and find his way home. And yet when he looked into her glowing eyes, he saw such hope and happiness that he could not bring himself to break her heart. She moved closer to him and rested her head against his shoulder, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And her body was warm, and her presence was oddly comforting, and Jake found himself putting his arm around her without really meaning to, and she made that musical sound again that he was starting to recognize as contentment. The storm raged outside for hours, and inside the cave they sat together by the blue fire, and she showed him things from her world, including plants that glowed in the dark, and stones that hummed with energy, and a book made of thin metal sheets with symbols he could not read. But she traced the symbols with her finger, and he understood they were love poems. As dawn approached, Jake realized he had a choice to make, because his ship was damaged, but not beyond repair, and he could fix it, and leave this planet, and this strange silver woman behind, or he could stay and learn about her world and maybe discover if the crystal had been right about them being compatible. She fell asleep against him as the first light of the purple sun came through the cave entrance, and Jake looked down at her peaceful face and felt something shift in his chest, because she had chosen him out of all the beings in the universe, and she offered him not just shelter, but a home and a future he had never imagined. When she woke, she took his hand and led him deeper into the cave and showed him that it was not just a cave, but an entire dwelling carved into the rock with rooms and furniture, and a life she had built while waiting, and she had been preparing for her mate without knowing who he would be or when he would come. Jake spent the day with her, learning her name, which sounded like wind chimes when she said it, but he called her Luna because it was the closest sound he could make, and she laughed and tried to say Jake, but it came out as a musical note that made him smile. She showed him how her people lived and how they bonded with their mates. And it was not just about the crystal, but about choosing each day to stay and to learn and to grow together. And Jake realized that maybe fate had not brought him to this planet by accident, but by design. By the time evening came, Jake had made his decision, and he took Luna's hand and pressed the crystal between their palms again. And this time, he did not pull away when it glowed, and through the connection he told her without words that he would stay. And he would learn her language and her ways, and he would be her mate if she would teach him how. Luna's eyes filled with tears that sparkled like diamonds, and she held him close, and Jake knew that he had found something more valuable than anything waiting for him back on Earth, because he had found someone who chose him and whom he was choosing in return. The storm had passed, and the purple sun shone brightly outside, but Jake did not leave the cave to return to his ship because he had found something better than rescue, and he had found a home in the most unexpected place with the most unexpected person. And sometimes the best things in life come when you are simply seeking shelter from the storm. Luna taught him her language over the following weeks, and he taught her his. And they learned to communicate not just with words, but with touches and glances and the comfortable silence of two people who belonged together. And Jake repaired his ship, but only to send a message home saying he had found a new life among the stars. He never regretted his choice because Luna showed him wonders beyond his imagination and loved him with a devotion that humbled him. And together they built a life that was strange and beautiful and completely their own. And Jake often thought about that night when he had stumbled into her cave, seeking only shelter, and had found instead his future and his heart.